Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who is not happy to discover that he has a new co-pilot,
Tim Longo.
That's not going to mean anything to you because you didn't get to the end of the game. But if you had, that would mean a lot, and I'm sure listeners are they're just dying out there. Well, that may be poor choice of words. Anyway, hello. Welcome back to Dev Game Club.
Nice.
I believe you have an introduction for us tonight.
I do. Today we have an interview, a very special guest. Rosie Katz is with us. In full disclosure, we do currently work with Rosie, and she happened to work on Dead Space. And so we took advantage of that, and she's gracious enough to come and spend some of her free time talking to us about Dead Space and reminiscing. So, I'll give a quick intro and introduction to Rosie, but she can also clarify and fill in any gaps that I forgot. I'm obviously just kind of mining from the internet as usual. So Rosie is a video gamer for life that she'll probably tell us about some of her early days, maybe. But also a creative person in many other areas, including music, art, audio design in her early years. She got her start right out of college as a tools QA lead, working on Tiger Woods 2007, I believe, at EA, Electronic Arts. And once she had learned the ropes on that project, and once the Dead Space team has started using the same technology, she transitions over to that team into QA, and then onto level design, working with the team directly on various levels there, which hopefully she can give us some stories about. She then decided to stick with level design and system scripting, and then worked on various EA games like Godfather 2, Dead Space 2, I think maybe some others, I might be wrong there, before leaving and moving to Sledgehammer Games, which was started by some ex-Visceral folks, as people may know. Again, working in level design on the Call of Duty franchise, which included Modern Warfare 2, Black Ops 2, Advanced Warfare, Vanguard. She worked on a lot of them. And then somehow, while being an awesome parent all the while, semi-recently, she even went back to teach at her alma mater to help inspire future game developers, which is also very cool. Maybe we can hear a little bit about that too. Now she is back in game dev directly working with us. We're very happy to have her and very gracious. And welcome to the podcast, Rosie.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a mouthful.
Hopefully I got everything. But yeah, obviously correct me. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. No, the only thing, let's see, the QA, when I was tools QA, I was actually I wasn't on a game because it was like a central tech.
Oh, okay, right. Got it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I got to just sort of take advantage of the engine that, before it was called Visceral, but EA, headquarters was using.
Redwood Shores or
Redwood
something.
Shores,
Years.
It was like EA Redwood Shores, but like not Sims, because Sims was there too.
Right.
And then, and then towards the end of my time on QA, they had me helping out on Tiger Woods doing modeling, like super random.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I saw you mention that too. You even got some art in there. And
Yeah.
So and you're still a musician, right? You still dabble in music, I think, right?
Yeah, I did. I did a lot when we went to help out on Black Ops 2. We were kind of like we went there for a month, and they sent us there. Me and my husband both worked on Call of Duty, so they sent both of us, like, yay, 2 workers for the price of 1. We could have 1 hotel or whatever.
Oh boy.
But yeah, they sent us there to work on it for a month, and we were sort of away from home in this kind of weird vibe, and I ended up getting back into music for that month. And then when we came back, it's like just too busy to actually have time to do it. But yeah.
Little one running around and stuff.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was before kids.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways that we do like to start, and you started getting into some of it right there, but we do tend to find that the audience likes to hear about how people kind of got into the industry. And even though I did
Yeah,
kind of give an overview, maybe you can give us your version in your own words, of sort of like how you the early
sure.
Rosie years,
Yeah,
and how you got to EA.
yeah. So I went to college for animation, like character animation.
Mm-hmm.
And my last year there, I kind of had a panic moment of like, what am I going to do with my life?
Sounds
And
familiar.
yeah, and it was
Yeah,
like
big same.
the dot-com boom was happening and price of living was going up, and I was scared. Like, how am I going to actually get a job that will pay for me to stay here? So yeah, I ended up like I applied for like a regular testing job, like game testing, and during the interview he said that he's like, can you tell me why you want this job? And I said, I really want to get into the game industry, and I'm hoping that I can meet developers, and this will be my like door in. And he's like, well, I gotta tell you, like, you're gonna be in a separate building. You're never gonna meet any developers, blah blah blah. And I'm like, oh no. So I was like, okay, well, I probably won't show up to the in-person interview then.
Oh, wow.
And so I was like, oh, that was probably a huge mistake. What did I do? I wasn't sure what, but I had to be honest because I didn't want to like lead him astray. So anyway, yeah, I didn't show up to that interview, and he said, don't worry, I'll put your resume like in this other pile.
Oh my gosh.
And then 4 months later, it was like because I had experience with Maya, so he wanted to keep me on the radar, I guess. And so 4 months later, he called back and was like, we have an opening testing our internal tools using Maya. And I was like, okay, I'll take it. So yeah,
Nice.
that's sort of my in.
Got it. And that was, refresh my memory, was that Render Man?
Renderware, yeah.
Renderware.
Yeah, so they were using Renderware, but the Central Tools department had started to develop this other tool that was a really robust Maya plugin. And so they were using it to make their models, like their destructible models.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were also starting to use it. The one I started testing was being used for level design also.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came on, we were just using Renderware, but then I was the person that got put on this new level design tool. So I ended up kind of using that to get into Dead Space because Dead Space was the only game at the studio that was going to be, well, they weren't the only game that was going to be using it, but they were the game that was going to be putting it under their budget. So it was going to be part of that game, I guess, budget-wise,
right.
like the way all that worked. So, so we would be using their assets to test out the tool. So, yeah,
You're right there.
Yeah, I was in basically.
Yeah. So does that mean? Sorry, we sometimes we do get into the weeds because I think it's one of our unique things about our podcast because we just devs talking to devs. But does that mean that level design was largely done in Maya using that plugin?
Yeah,
okay.
We did it all in Maya, but it was like we had obviously we had level designers who were used to using either Renderware, and we even had a designer who was used to using Radiant, which is what I ended up using on Call of Duty. And so there was a lot they didn't like about Maya. So they tried to make it kind of level designer friendly. Like we had a bunch of like basically like hallway kits that we could piece it together and not have to like model everything out,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, texturing was awful.
Yeah, wow,
like,
crazy.
Yeah, texturing block worlds was no fun because it was like, I know this is not going to be seen by anyone, and here I am spending all day texturing grid textures.
Yeah,
Or UVing.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Sorry, UVing.
Yeah.
Right, because it just it doesn't, nothing like that came out of the box for level design.
Yeah.
It's just, Yeah, that's a good point. That's a missed kind of hidden step that you would never even think about in this situation. That
Yeah, right.
doesn't
Like,
come for
yeah.
free.
Yeah.
It's also one of those things that like seems like a good idea to engineers, I think. Honestly, it's like, well, it's already got all the tools right there for doing all the 3D stuff. We don't have to make it again.
Right.
And it does not it's a bad idea, as it turns out. It just sounds like a really good idea, because there's a lot of stuff that, and speaking as an engineer, like it's a perspective we don't have of like, well, what's wrong with that? And back then, was starting to thaw a little bit, I think, but back then there was a tendency to be just like, well, the engineers made the decision, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And so we did it, Yeah. And thankfully that has changed, because we are often not the best stewards for art or animation or design or really anybody but ourselves.
Yeah, I don't even think that decision came from engineering, though. I think it came from EA and just wanting to like, I think they wanted to end the licensing they had with Renderware. Or maybe it was just getting outdated and like they couldn't get everything they wanted out of it. So I don't know, but like that's what it seemed like. Yeah, it was like deals happening.
And that was, I mean, it wasn't too much long, or maybe they had already bought DICE. I mean, there was sort of like, there's the era of them transitioning to Frostbite eventually, and like, the sort of that whole thing, and every big publisher trying to rally behind some sort of internal tech and amortize it across all of the different studios, like Ubi does, and like, although Ubi has a whole other weirder approach, but EA did at least, like, right, there was a point when it's like everyone must use Frostbite, so which was much later, but So what was the transition? So I also took a very similar path to yourself. I came from QA and used the tool and then went into level design, and so I'm familiar with that. But like, what was that from your perspective there? Like, what was that transition like? Like, was it fun using the tool in QA and then kind of dabbling, and then did you like do some test levels, and like how did you get the job to to move to Dead Space? Like, what was that like?
So even though we were on Dead Space's budget, Dead Space wasn't even greenlit yet. So that's kind of weird. Like, I think they were planning that once it got greenlit, we would be on their budget. So we were just kind of prepping for it. And shortly after I got onto Dead Space, I think they ended up closing down the central tech group department completely. So that may have been like a limbo period where we like, but anyways, so it was awesome. When I look back on Tools QA, it was so fun. You had no responsibility, but you just got to make pretend levels all day.
Yeah, right. That's awesome. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like, old jobs I had where you just have fun, like with your coworkers, and there's not really a lot of pressure,
Yeah.
We had like a really tight-knit QA group, and but everyone was on a different tool. So I had it was called Neo. I had Neo, and then another coworker of mine had a character animation tool that she was working on testing. And then she got an email from Condry, who was the I guess he was the main development director on Dead Space. And his email said that they were looking for someone who knew that character tool to come on the animation team for Dead Space. And so she sent it to me, and I don't know why she gave that, like offered that up to me, but I don't think she wanted the job, or for whatever reason,
well, that was nice of her.
Yeah. She offered it up to me like, hey, do you want to do this or take advantage of this opportunity? And I was like, well, I'm not going to pretend I know that tool. Like, I haven't tested it, but I'll send an email because I wouldn't mind working on Dead Space. So I said, and also like it didn't seem fair to her too. Like she's the expert. So I I emailed him back. I didn't realize, like who he was. I just was like, okay.
Yeah.
And I emailed him back and I said, I don't know that tool, but I know Neo, and you guys are going to be adopting this tool soon for level design. Like, if you need a level designer, like I would be happy to help with that.
Oh, nice move.
Yeah. So that worked. And then I had already developed like a rapport with the Dead Space team. There was only one level designer, so on Dead Space.
Oh, wow.
Because it was really early on. And so I had developed a rapport with him already because the engineer for the tool would send me over to help them whenever they needed something with it. So, so so then his manager messaged me and said, we want you to come over, we'll do a little like test. So
like a level design test or something?
Yeah, level design test. So I set up like a trigger and a spawner, and that was it.
Oh, okay. All right. That was not what I was expecting. Okay.
Yeah, he's like, can you set up like a little, NPC, like combat scenario?
Yeah. So it wasn't a creative test as much as a function, like a technical test.
Yeah, it was more technical. And then, so I did that, but that was like really easy for me to do because I had already been doing that, as part of my test.
Dozens of times a day.
Yes. Yeah. And then I had a meeting with Condry, and he just like sat me down and chatted with me, like a little talk kind of thing. And then he's like, well, we'd love to have you. So that was it. That was the extent. And then I was still QA budget. So even though the tool was part of Dead Space budget, I was part of QA budget, which was like a different department. So so I worked 50-50. So like half my time on QA, half my time as like entry level designer on Dead Space. And I obviously got the pay of my QA pay.
Yeah.
That's how that works.
Yeah, that's how that works. And but I was happy to do it because I wanted the experience. And so yeah, and then after, I don't know how that worked. I was already full-time QA. And then I think at some point after like 6 months, there was like a trial period where I was doing 50-50. Maybe it was only 3 months. They hired me on like as an actual Dead Space designer.
Full-time.
Yeah, full-time. Yeah.
Cool. Wow. Nice. Well, I mean, I think that's a wonderful example of the inner workings of a big publisher, of like, do what you got to do, right, to find the path for yourself. And I think so that's an awesome story. So I mean, so were you at all a fan of what was your perspective on Dead Space at the time? Are you a fan of survival horror? Were you excited about it? Was it just happened to be the game that you were testing for? Or what was your perspective on Dead Space?
Yeah, so it's funny because I wasn't really like a gamer, and so but I have a keen eye for quality.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You're like, this is quality.
And compared to the other games that were going on in the studio, like I had access to Godfather, and a lot of the team that was on Dead Space came from Bond, from Russia with Love or something.
Yeah.
And so I still had access to the Bond assets too that I could test around with. And then I had access to I think it was Godfather. Yeah, I think that was it. There was Simpsons also, but that was renderware. So when we went over to Neo, we didn't have anyway.
And Dante's Inferno hadn't started yet.
Oh yeah, Dante's Inferno hadn't started yet. So
that
happened
later.
after.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it was basically between Godfather and Dead Space. And I mean, for me, no offense to Godfather,
Yeah, but Dead
but
Space was your jam.
yeah,
Yeah.
I really could tell like, oh wow, this is a cool game. Like you, there's so much. Even that early, they were just starting on the vertical slice, and I think they called it an X slice.
Yeah, that sounds like
Yeah,
an EA term.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's also a bold new direction for EA, right? Because
Yeah.
it's, you're talking about all these other licensed titles.
Yep.
And this was, as we mentioned in the series, this was kind of an era where they were like starting to do different things. I mean, I guess they got the sweet Dante license, but a lot of people are clamoring for it. But I mean, you're talking about these other titles, and it's all their old model, which was like buy something that's well known, make something around it. The genre is kind of defined by the property, and go. And this Dead Space thing was a whole new direction for them. It wasn't something they'd really even done before that I can remember.
No,
Not a lot of EA survival horror.
Yeah, I don't think EA knew how to handle it either, because like there was a lot of pressure on us to be more action game and less survival horror.
We were wondering about that. Yeah, and Ian has shared stories about that too.
Okay, yeah, and I know Glenn did an amazing job. He was the EP on Dead Space.
Mm-hmm.
He did a really good job at sort of like showing execs the actiony parts of our game and saying, yeah, it's action. Meanwhile, like shielding us from that a lot, and then we could kind of be more creative. So
yeah. Which is so funny because they're making a remake, they're rebooting it. It's sort of like so. Yeah, it's just so funny that trust the team, and sometimes those magical things will happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think from a marketing standpoint, it still holds true that action games sell more. So I'm sure they were just like data
by the numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the soul of the game like required a lot of creative freedom that they needed to give us, that I don't think they saw that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, we talked about, and Brett was saying, I think last episode, that the end of the game sounds like it's more actiony, and I couldn't remember, and I didn't get to get all the way up to there before talking to you, but it's definitely a survival horror game, but I feel like when you compare it to something like Resident Evil 4 or something like that, it does lend itself, though it's not as polished in the action area as something like Gears or something like that, but it does a better job than RE4 when it comes to the shooting or whatever, right? It doesn't have tank controls. It's a little more traditional in that way. So so it edged there a little bit. But,
yeah. I mean, we were inspired by RE4 and BioShock big time.
Yeah, totally. I can see that.
Yeah, those were sort of the two big sort of, you must play these games.
Yeah, right.
But then also Gears, like we did look at Gears of War a little bit for some stuff, like how do we handle this problem that we're trying to solve,
Yeah. So especially the strafe shooting controls for third person, versus the other two, So what was So you got on the team. Congratulations, good job. What's your you're newly minted level designer. What's the day-to-day like for you? Like how did you? Well, actually, before you hit that, I wanted to ask about. And maybe because you were working with them through QA, you kind of this was already infused into you as you were joining the team. But one thing that I think we both talked about in this series that I think it still makes the game a classic in a lot of ways is it's a very cohesive game. I mean, it's a very pure, consistent experience. It's very cohesively built. Like you said, the soul and the tone of the game is very pure, and I just really appreciate that about the game. So were you coming on, it sounds like you kind of already got it. You already knew what the pitch was, what the pillars were, et cetera, et cetera. Was that the case?
Yeah, they never talked about the pillars, or it was like sort of
Ah,
like you almost didn't need to because it was just all consuming to the team.
that's so cool.
Because I remember. I mean, I got on pretty early, so maybe after. I don't. I don't know. I'm trying to remember if we ever made like any type of like pillar. I don't even know
Yeah.
if the word pillar was common back then.
No, maybe not. Maybe not. But it was like a vision. Like there wasn't like. I mean, I think you kind of answered the question, and it's a really interesting answer because maybe the team knew, like it was just obvious. I don't know if
Kind of
obvious.
was, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, it wasn't always obvious. Like there were certain things that it's so interesting because like I noticed for myself and some other employees, like we were huge Star Trek fans, right? But then you also had the Star Wars camp,
Ah,
right?
yeah.
And so there was a little bit of this like we aren't all inspired by the same things, but we all know what we want this game to be. And I don't know, like it was almost like it had a mind of its own. Like it just you knew by looking at the game what it should be, you know.
That's
Tim, I can't believe you had "I admire its purity" right there, and you just left it. But that's fine. Okay.
I don't. What?
That's what Ian Holmes says about the alien.
Oh, nice. Okay, yeah, that's too deep of a cut. I would have missed it.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
Well, it's like I think it's accurate to say that Brett's the Star Trek and I'm the Star Wars. And
that is correct. Yeah.
And
yeah. You've got your Star Wars jammies.
we've got our schism here, but yeah, I mean, to your point, Rosie, like in spite of the fact that you have different inspirations for sci-fi, the fact that there still was this Venn diagram that Dead Space fit in, and everyone kind of just got it for the most part is really. Yeah. That's a special thing because I've talked about this. There's actually a colleague of mine back at Crystal Dynamics, Noah Hughes, who's one of the most brilliant designers I've ever worked with, and he would often joke. We would both joke about sort of the concept of sometimes games sort of just need to let themselves. They need the room to let themselves be who they are going to be. It's like the game is just going to be what it's going to be. Despite pillars or despite, arguments or debates or whatever, to some degree, it's just going to happen and organically. And I love that it sounds like the friction was pretty low for this game.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the team did such a good job of getting that initial X-Slice to be a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
That it was the messenger, like, this is what we're making.
Yeah.
Now make everything as cool as this. So our X-Slice was chapter 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to ask. I wasn't sure. Yeah. Okay. Cool. And that chapter 3 has the what you call it in it, right? The centrifuge.
Centrifuge.
Yeah, the big spinny bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. So it was the whole level.
Yeah, it was the whole level. We ended up taking some stuff out of it, I think, to put in other levels because it was jam packed. We had to fit all of our, core mechanics in there. Yeah, or the core stuff, and so we ended up, for pacing purposes, kind of like pulling some stuff out of it. But for the most part, it stayed the same. Yeah.
Neat. Okay, so
that's a good level. That's a good level to be the level.
Yeah.
As we talked about it, that particular experience really does seem like the model experience, that centrifuge room, because it pulls in. You can see when you say that, I'm like, of course, it's that one. Like that makes the most sense. It pulls in all the elements. With the gravity, zero gravity, the air problems, the having to use the different powers and all that stuff. It's all there. We talked about that when we played it, and we were like, "Oh yeah, this is perfect. This is the thing. You totally get it." Yeah.
Yeah. I remember we spent so much time, just sort of like with all the little like nuanced details of like, you open the door, you have to know it's 0G. How are we going to do that? Let's put a corpse go by, and then like the little droplets are also 0G, the droplets of blood that are coming out of the corpse, and like just so much attention to detail of like how to sell it. I still think the centrifuge is actually kind of complex puzzle for like, it's a lot actually going on in one.
In one room.
In one room. It's and it's a big room, so like knowing where to go could probably be confusing to a player. But
there was only one. I mean, I agree with you. I think if it were the first level, definitely would have been much a different story for sure. But I think it's the third chapter. We were talking about the ramp up was good enough to where putting the pieces together wasn't too bad. The one exception was we didn't find an introduction to the GUI bits that make that slow you down. Like the corruption. Oh, is that what it's called? Okay, okay. The official term. That was, I think that tripped us up. But for the most part, it was like it was one of those moments where it's those great moments where you realize you have all the tools you need and you start putting them piece by piece together, like using the ability, using both abilities and the air and it's just, I don't know, it kind of came together.
The other thing for me was the orientation, the jumps, and those could be disorienting. But what I will say to its credit, because as the game went on, I got much better at that, and it became very natural to me eventually. And this was only, I think, maybe the second room where you do it, and there's no pressure on you to do that, right? There's no time pressure for it, so it's actually it's fine from that standpoint. It actually gives you time to learn it some more, so it's even still tutorializing at that point. And so, I'm reflecting back on it. I was like, oh yeah, I had trouble orienting myself in there, but there wasn't anything coming to bite my legs off, from a direction that I had to figure out where they were now, because they all appeared in the 0G part, or in the zero oxygen part afterwards. It was where the enemies appeared, which was also super cool. Like, I come around a corner and you've got jump scares and you got to run in there because the centrifuge is coming, etc. It's a great set piece.
In Dead Space 2, they did it more like a jet boots.
Yes,
and
right.
That would help with your disorientation. Because you can see.
You're more driving. It's more like swimming or something.
Yeah, it doesn't break the 180 rule or whatever because you're kind of like you're in control. Yeah.
So okay. So sorry, good deep dive there. So can we go back to maybe a little bit of the day to day for you and like what that process was like for you ramping up and becoming level designer? Like what does a level designer do on Dead Space?
Yeah. So initially it was I went on to chapter 3 and it was with another designer, and then we had a creative director who was sort of just becoming a creative director from level design. And then we also had our manager who came from level design also. So even though there was one level designer, we had level design influence.
A lot of support.
A lot of support. So I came on to chapter 3 and was mostly helping Casper, the other designer, do like the combat setups and a lot of that nuanced stuff. Like, let's put corpses here, and here. Let's, it was very like associate level designer work. Like very much helping. And also, because I came from tools, I was helping a lot with like, why isn't this working?
Right. Troubleshooting. Technical design, what we would call it today. Right?
It probably would have been a technical design role initially. And then we decided, or just started to. So my day to day, it would have been like a lot of figuring out where the NPCs were going to spawn from, foreshadowing. So like when you're walking down a hallway, having the the NPC crawl underneath the grating.
Oh, yeah.
And figuring light stuff out, like, kind of like where can we put lights, even though I'm not a lighter, like we had a lighting department, but working with other departments a lot. So level design was the bottleneck for implementation. So we had to set up everything as far as like animated sequences and streaming. We had to handle streaming too. So like, like when all the door streaming, and the elevator streaming.
Elevators,
so, yeah. We would be in charge of like picking what zones, like what models for the environment would load at the door, and what would unload and load at the door, and then also we had to separately say what would be culled out or not. So like it was a 2-step process. You'd load it and then you'd say I want it visible. Oof. So we had to keep track of all that, and it was at one point I was like, this is kind of ridiculous. Like I think I'm spending like 80% of my time just on streaming.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, if you have to hand manage it, I mean that is really that's a lot. You're right. And so my question, I guess, is if you were in Maya, was like the whole level loaded all the time in Maya?
No.
Or did you have like pieces?
We had, we had zones. We had this system called meta models. So it was like, you know how like models have LODs? Mm-hmm, we could kind of use that type of technology to like load and unload.
Oh, sure. Okay. So you had like a stand-in model so that you could manage that. Because my next question was like, well, if they're different, if they're not all loaded in, how do you manage the connections between them? But you do it by having a low LOD, right?
Yeah, it would be. So we would have the zones all organized by name. So it'd be like, I just left the control room and I'm going into this decontamination room. And then there's the hallway zone in between. And so then you would say like, while I'm in the hallway zone, I'm going to start loading that future decontamination room and start unloading the control room.
Holy
and
cow.
then when the load finishes, hey, turn it on so I can actually see it.
Do you see people? Do you see what the designers go through to give you your games?
Yeah, and so
I was about to give your technical people a hard time, but then I'm like thinking back to what I made Troy do for Starfighter to make the droid control chip work, which was just an absolute nightmare.
Embarrassing. It's embarrassing. No,
it is. It really is.
I mean, out of everything, I would say streaming was the only thing that was like that. A lot of other stuff was like beneficial, where we had a lot of control over stuff that was nice. But yeah, the culling was interesting because it allowed us to do this thing where we could preemptively load stuff. I think we were allowed to have like 10 zones. No. I think we could have up to 10 zones, like 5 loaded, 5 unloaded, or something like that.
Wow.
And so you could start to load. You could be like, okay, well, they're going to eventually get over there. Let's start loading it now, like really early, and not have it draw yet. But our game was super linear, and that meant if you went backwards, it could break the loading, and you'd probably end up sitting at doors for a while.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I've seen it happen.
Yep. Especially, the elevators. I think you notice it too. But we did make a note that even in the elevators, you all did a great job with maintaining the tone of the game, while you're waiting, because there was still like the audio design and the lighting, like you said, and just like even Rumble might have even been in there, but just even though it was
you didn't, for example, stall. I mean, I've played games from not that much earlier, which would just like stall, just straight up like, I guess the disc is spinning now, I can remember that happening, maybe even to one game that we played on the cast. So it's you did great with it, because I mean, and it was good to do it in those spots because of course you had elements that were still moving, right? So that it was never like just,
Right.
like never just a hard hang for, and I'm not talking like minutes or anything, but just like you can see like, oh, there's a 3-second just like waiting for some data, and we're just going to sit here and look at this lovely rendered frame for 3 seconds.
Right.
You had like those little elevator tickers that were just going, and looping around, and just that tick, those mechanical clicky ticks, were just great to like maintain the progression, right? I mean, it feeling like you're still moving.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting point because level design was forced to do this super mundane thing, we had to come up with solutions that weren't boring to us, but like, if it were systematic, like we wouldn't have come up with those solutions. And like
constraints.
Like we had a lot of story to deliver, and it was always difficult to find enough space to put those video logs and audio logs and all the logs. And so
all the logs.
And even like the story animation bits too, like finding space for all that sometimes felt difficult. So
wow, interesting. Yeah.
And the loading.
Well, I feel like the pacing turned out well then. If you felt like it was cramped, it came out really well, and it's cool to hear, for me at least, to hear sort of a little bit about the process. It sounds like, and I wanted to actually dig into this because I know you're big into communication as a level designer working with other disciplines. And if you were the bottleneck, like, can you talk a little bit about the experience of collaborating with those other disciplines? Because the game is so well paced, and like the attention to detail, like you said, that's a lot of orchestration for even an associate kind of level design.
Yeah. I do feel like it was a lot. So we would usually be given sort of like a level breakdown of what needed to happen story-wise in the level. And then sometimes, especially for me, they would give me a Maya file with like a block world already even. So our creative director, because he came from level design, he, sometimes him and our manager would sometimes do the like the initial layout.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, it's weird because I thought that's normal.
I wish.
Now I know that's not. And I don't know if it was because I was junior or, and that was early on too. And if it was because I was junior, it's kind of like, wow, I had no idea how to do actual level design from that, I felt like that a lot. Like I didn't, until I got onto Call of Duty, where I was actually making layouts. I was like, oh, this is level design. Like,
from scratch, you mean kind of
from scratch, and pitching themes and, stuff like that. Whereas with Dead Space, it was much more like already there for me, and it was just a matter of like, how do I plug in this gameplay? What was nice about it was that I could also kind of like spend a lot of time on the combat, and like the more nuanced stuff, I could focus on that.
That's great. I was going to ask you about other systems and other gameplay loops like combat and how that interacted with your level design. So you were doing the encounter design as well? Okay.
Yeah, and eventually I did do level design, like actual level stuff, but it was usually filling in gaps initially, like in the early year. Early times. And then you mentioned like collaboration. We had dailies every day, so we would all get in a room. I don't know if it was every day, actually. It might have only been like every week, and we would play through each level. I mean, for the directors it was every day, but for my level, it was only once a week. And it was like it was a dark room, like a theater room. We have the game playing. We would just go like minute by minute through the level and just nitpick it and like, yeah. And our first phase of level design was like simple scripting, so we would set up the pacing first.
Oh, okay.
So
Interesting. Yeah. Makes sense for a horror game.
Yeah, because it's so important. So we would
Yeah.
pace everything out with just triggers and debug text initially.
Perfect. I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's like Brett just said, that's the stuff you really need to get right. And so putting that in later is not going to really work. You're going to want to pace it out and get the sense of it early on, so you can then, like build around it, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
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 Were there any survival horror tenets? Was it very organic and kind of like iterative for the most part, or were there any like survival horror tenets that people tried to, kind of consistently use or remind each other of?
Yeah, there was some stuff, but I was so junior level that I think it went over my head. Like, I remember in dailies, our creative director kind of saying like something about like key first versus lock, like how we're gonna, or vice versa. Like, I can't even remember what he said, but it was like I just remember it, that specific thing, because I was so confused by it. Like,
probably lock first and then
lock
key.
First.
Yeah, lock first, then key, or something like that.
Yeah, those basic things. Yeah, kind of from like a logic. Yeah, like
And then there was a lot around, like Isaac not talking. That was like something we decided on, sort of as we were going. I think it came down to budget. Like, we can't really afford to have all these VO lines, even like on disc. I don't even know if we had space for them. So yeah.
I mean, that's a great constraints can really let creativity flourish, and that's a great example, because in pre-show we were talking a little bit about that, right? Of how kind of important it is to the feel of the game that he is a silent protagonist. And how that changes later, and it really works well for this game. So then what was, so this is a hard question, I know, and we do try to ask it sometimes, but when it comes to takeaways for yourself, and many years later, and you've worked on, and hopefully we get a little bit of time to talk about like some of the stuff you worked on later, just to hear sort of how your progression has gone as a level designer. But when you look back at Dead Space, and I know memory is a hard thing for all of us, but like, are there takeaways or things that you remember? Well, not as much, Brett, but are there takeaways or things you remember about those early days on Dead Space specifically that you still keep with you today? Or things, lessons or like anecdotes, or I don't know if there's anything like that.
Yeah, for sure. Like the push for quality, and polish. Like we were polishing from the beginning, because it's so important for a survival horror game.
Yeah.
So polish was sort of built in from the beginning, and then the push for quality was just like, watching the same cinematic over and over again, nitpicking, like, how can we make it better? How can we make it better? And then
can we? I mean, can you think of an example of something that you were polishing early on, just to give folks a sense? Because I mean, we probably all have a sense, but I'm curious, like, if you could think of like one particular thing, maybe from your X slice. I can't believe I just said those words together.
Well, EA's big about the X, right? Like, X is EA's big. That's what their vision. We don't want to get into it, but
It's so funny, because that was my first game and I had no idea, and then we go to Call of Duty and I'm like, why isn't it called an X slice? Why are we calling it a V slice now?
The irony.
So I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but like the blood droplets coming out of the corpse in 0G, like a lot of that stuff, but the foreshadowing, and like we may have a hallway with no gameplay, but we can't just let it be no gameplay. Like, we need to like do something.
Yeah.
And so we had audio in very early, like doing little fake stingers, and so it wasn't like, when I say polish, like it wasn't like we were just like, oh, let's get this gameplay in, that we called out that we were going to do. It was a lot of like, let's get this gameplay in and sell it. Like,
Yeah.
And I think there was a lot of pressure on us to sell it because EA wasn't sure about it. Like, they, they were still questioning whether or not the game should be happening.
Right.
So,
well, I mean, you proved them wrong about that. I mean, because it's, one of their most successful, original IPs ever, because it had multiple sequels. I mean, it's getting a remake, I guess. It's amazing to think of how much, they did, because it also had a lot of spin-off as well, properties. So
there was the Nintendo Wii version that was like like a rail shooter.
I played that. Yeah.
And a lot of those people ended up on Dead Space 2 when we left. They ended up, like, I think the EP and the DD of that game ended up becoming the creative director for Dead Space 2, and like, so there was a lot going on with it. But yeah.
So in limited time left, but if we can spend a little bit of time, even though it's not Dead Space focused, I still would love to hear, because you actually you gave a couple. You shared a couple comments of like, oh, okay, when I'm now on
this is real level design.
Moving over, and we don't get the privilege of having level designers on all the time. So I'd love to hear if you can share a little bit of that transition from Visceral to Sledgehammer, and then from Dead Space to Call of Duty being pretty different as well. Like, what was that like for you?
Yeah, so the main thing was just how linear Dead Space was. So it was like all hallways, and even when you had a combat, it was like a room.
Yeah.
And everything was indoors. So, except for, a few cool moments where you got to go outside. In space. But for the most part, it was all indoors. And there wasn't a lot of options. So like, when we started working on Modern Warfare 3, it was like wide linear was that concept was opened up to me, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Like, it was like, oh, and I was just thinking today, like, what it would have been like if I had done Call of Duty first and then Dead Space, like, if I would have designed the levels differently, and I definitely would have, like, I definitely would have like pushed for more of that, because it's my preference, like, to give the player choice.
Can you imagine a wide linear Dead Space game? Sounds so good.
Maybe the new one is.
Yeah. Or Callisto Protocol maybe is doing something like that, but I don't know. But
yeah, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know.
So you were doing initially on Modern Warfare. I think you mentioned you were doing single player first.
Yeah, and then the single player levels were sort of informed by multiplayer, I felt like. So, and vice versa. Like, there was a lot of like, oh, we're going to use single player assets on multiplayer, and sometimes use multiplayer assets on, there was crossover there.
Yeah.
So it was like one database of assets to steal from.
Right.
So I just enjoyed that, like, more outdoor, more realistic. I love sci-fi though, so yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed working on Advanced Warfare. It was like the best of both to me.
Right. You get the mixture in there.
Yeah.
So what about, so you mentioned pitching themes and in the early layout phases, like what was that transition like for you, where you were from scratch, like you
Yeah.
mentioned, like there was, because Dead Space was so linear and so story driven, I can imagine it being handed to level
Yeah.
design quite a bit. But now was it on Call of Duty? Was it sort of like, blank slate or?
Yeah. I mean, we had story points, but we weren't getting handed any layouts for sure. So that was all on us. And like, I'm having a hard time remembering, but I think on Dead Space we did do our own layouts. It's just that like I think because I was junior initially, like I was so like
They're helping.
like I did do layouts on Dead Space 1, especially Dead Space 2. I did chapter 1 layout. But there was just something about that more wide linear that felt like, okay, I have more I can give the player more options, and it was much more rewarding. And then our scripting system was like way better.
Nice.
Yeah.
Seeing the other side at that point,
Yeah.
Because it was multiple games in Call of Duty systems. So.
Oh yeah, and it was established. Like, it was nice.
And then I believe you worked on multiplayer levels as well eventually?
Yes.
Right?
So
so tell us about the difference there.
Yeah, so I think that because everyone came from Dead Space, we were really, and we worked on single player for Modern Warfare 3. I think we were more single player focused, but I was really drawn into the more like system based stuff and more sandboxy stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had the opportunity to like make some MP maps for DLC for Modern 3. And so we all the single player designers kind of like started making MP maps when we were done with the single player.
Yeah.
And it was so fun to play them internally, like it just that was a whole other world that opened up of like, playing, playing with your coworkers, and it's super fun. So yeah, I was like, yes, I'm definitely gonna try to do multiplayer if this becomes a thing, like if we get to have a choice,
Right.
And then we did end up having a choice. Our DLC never ended up being taken. Like IW ended up doing the DLC along with other helper studios, so they never took any of our maps, but we had tons of fun internally playing our MP maps.
Yeah, there is something. I mean, I agree with you. There's something magical about multiplayer map iteration and just playtesting and stuff, where it's just somebody's got a layout and it's in its blockout form, and you have your sandbox gameplay already established, and COD it's so established, right? So what, especially if you've already finished the campaign, so everything that's at your disposal, and then you're just making these maps and trying to leverage that stuff, and then you just get to play it every day, and it is a really fun process. I mean, it's I'm sure there's a lot of modders out there that have a similar experience, right, where you're modding for a shipped game, and you can just it's going back to your QA days where you're just making levels for fun, right? And
I think it's so rewarding too that you could have your level played over and over and over and over again by with people playing together. Like if you tell someone what level you worked on for a Call of Duty map, they know, the public knows the levels, and it's like a big part of the game. Whereas if I were to tell someone, I worked on such and such level for single player, they may not have even played single player, and it might not have been memorable for them, and they weren't forced to traverse it over and over and over again. So it felt like I had more impact on MP.
The hours people put into those maps, and learning
and the fame.
and the shifting, the other shorter stuff that shifts with time, right, is that because people sort of discover ways. Like you see people's creativity come to play in the maps that are played again and again and again, right? It's like, the meta starts out here and then it shifts to here because, it might be because of some balancing change. And it's like, now it makes sense to go this way. And like, it's super interesting to me, as somebody who's just like, I just code the numbers, to think about how something evolves in that way, as a space. And so when you're working in that sort of wide linear, as you describe, or just going wider for multiplayer to be more accurate, I guess, to see a space evolve over time with play must also be super exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the MP maps would be like 3-lane arena type layouts,
Mm-hmm.
and then single player would be like if you were to string a bunch of those together and only go through it once. So it was like it was more bang for the buck. Like I could make a smaller area, but it was going to be played from every angle over and over again, different ways. And so it was less work and more rewarding.
Nice.
I remember at some point when Titanfall was about to come out and there was some talk that they wouldn't have single player. We were talking, it was like, ooh, what's happening with Titanfall? We were like, I was like, can we not do single player too? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of effort and polish goes into something that most players will play at most once.
Yeah,
not even once, but at most once, as you point out.
Yeah, the NPCs are enjoying it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so funny. Interesting. Oh, wow. So, thank you, Rosie, for doing this and coming on. It's really cool to hear. And I'm glad, even though it wasn't Dead Space focused, it was glad that we got to talk about sort of where you went in those days and over your career and what interests you kind of got into. So, it's a little bit of an obvious question, but are there any parting thoughts for budding level designers out there, or modders, or anyone who's interested in the space? Because you're principal at this point and kicking butt, and a lot of good advice I think is coming from this interview.
Maybe push yourself to work on things that you don't play or you wouldn't normally want to work on, and see where it goes, because you might come up with like really creative solutions to stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And meaning in the multiplayer context for you, that kind of like where
for me it was like sort of being pushed to work on games that I wouldn't normally work on or play, and like it made me, I think, a better problem solver in some ways. But looking back on Dead Space, I'm like, oh man, there's a lot of stuff I should have done better.
That's healthy though. That's healthy. I think that's good, right? Especially as your first job. But we are playing that game for the podcast, so it's like, it's still not that we're the end all be all, but it holds up. I know you're being critical of yourself and your work, which is healthy, but just it still holds up. It's still a very good game. But that. You don't need us to tell you that. Thank you for soul. Yeah, it's got the soul. It's got soul in spades. So thank you for coming on, Rosie.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super appreciate it. Welcome back from the break. I know you were thrilled, of course. I barely said anything to speak with a level designer. It's always good to have good to have someone in your discipline, and so you can pick their brains.
It was a wonderful interview, and great to have Rosie on, and also very similar journey for both of us. So it was fun to. It was fun to, and we both worked on various very similar things along our time too, the types of level design. So it was fun to, albeit different eras, because a little older than
Yep.
her.
A little older. Yeah.
But yeah, it was great, and I just love her. I just love her approach to things, and the way she was sort of describing some of her revelations, and yeah, it was wonderful. I was so glad that she came.
I will say I echo her, thinking that like you wish you could go back and do it again, or you'd do things totally different if you did it again.
Yeah.
Like I played one of the Starfighters, maybe around 10 years ago now, and watching and just like, had to cover my eyes at points at looking at, code that I had written, as it played out on the screen and being like, oh man, I've learned so much.
Yeah.
And
oh, me too. Yeah.
You can't go home again, and thankfully not, but every experience enriches what we do next. And it was really interesting to hear her perspectives on the early part of her career. We didn't even talk about her, teaching at all that much.
Oh, I totally forgot. That's my bad. I had it down in notes. Yeah.
Yep. But we gotta, so it's which is a whole nother part of it. Almost want to have a part 2 and say, let's talk about how you take, doing a thing and then teaching the thing.
Yeah, we'll have her on again someday when we play some Call of
Yeah.
Duty game or something. I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's anyway, yeah, we haven't had tons of level design on, and it's great to hear that discipline, because we talk about it a lot because of your perspective, and it's great to hear. It's great finally to hear somebody else's perspective on it. So
yeah, well, and I think, I mean, obviously some of it was just the way that the stars aligned, etc. But she, and she told us her very proactive approach to to getting on a Dead Space, which was great. But I think just being a game for her in her early career to experience that kind of team. It sounds like the team culture was interesting and dynamic, and their goals were very clear. And her point about just like, when I asked about vision and pillars and sort of like how, and how it was delivered, or how the team sort of saw that. But when she described the fact that it kind of just was there and kind of obvious, it makes sense. Like, I don't question it, right? It's totally like, yeah, I could totally see it.
It's also 100% consistent all the way through. Like, you don't, it's definitely a thing that you can look back at. I mean, maybe it's starting to be less this at this era, but even if you look at BioShock, which, she mentioned, like, there's definitely some schizophrenia there at times. Like, some of the levels feel very different. Like, and
I think the ending doesn't hold up.
Right, and the ending, of course, in particular, right, is like,
levels.
that doesn't make sense at all. Yeah, none of that really works anymore. Didn't really even work at the time, especially the literal final battle. It's not quite as cohesive as you'd sort of think. It definitely feels like very different levels, which is also fine. I mean, I think that actually works fine for that game, that it feels like, because there's like these factions that are, individuals who are kind of fighting for their own area of this whole thing. It's all individualism and all that stuff. So like it makes sense.
Yeah, they're different. But, yeah, right.
Yeah, they're different games, right? So
but for a survival horror, single location.
Yeah, mostly single location. Yeah, you do go down to the planet, but for the most part, yeah, it's one thing, and that is really consistent throughout. So, yeah, but it's also lucky to start off, testing the tool, because what a great opportunity to like, the old adage about a potter being taught, teaching people to throw, 1,000 pots versus one. You divide the class in half, and it's like, this half of the class does 1,000 pots, and this half of the class does one pot, and the people who do one pot do one lousy pot. The people who do 1,000 pots, really get somewhere. And
masters.
If every day you're testing this tool, like, you're going to be, fiddling around and being like, well, I wonder how to do this, and then you're the resource for that team as well, even as a junior person, to go onto the team with the level designers, and when people are having trouble, to be the resource. That's gold for, I guess what we'd call an associate now is you come in, you're a resource for them, but that means you're talking with the experienced people all the time as well. Right. And you're seeing what they're doing, and you're having the conversations. What are you trying to do? Right. And then it just naturally turns into, why, and it's just like, you just pick up so much. What a great position to be in, for somebody just starting out, for sure. So super cool. Super cool. Yeah, great to hear about. Yeah, wow, it's very cool. Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have had their perspective. I haven't had a lot of time with Rosie on the team yet, so it's because I don't directly work with level design too often. So
she's awesome.
Yeah, she's great. She's really great. I really love her energy as well and her perspective. So thanks again, Rosie. Really, really great to have you on. We to spoil next week, we are actually likely to have another interview. We actually had to do a little switcheroo on our interviews. We had another one planned for this week, and that interviewee came down sick at the last minute, so we're pushing it to next week. So we should have another interview for you next week, and then additional production notes. We're then going to do our end of year and take the week off between Christmas and New Year's this year, and come back with something new in the new year. So that's what you have to look forward to. I'm going to go ahead and throw out there, if you have sort of end of year thoughts yourself and want to shoot an email, please send it along our way, and we'll try to both put in our clips and also maybe answer some of those or discuss them on the end of year show. We'd also love to have your reviews or email. We don't have an email this week. You can send those to devgameclub@gmail.com. And, of course, reviews for the sort of Apple infrastructure or things that I will see. Help us reach new listeners. And if you do give a review on some other platform that I don't subscribe to, just let us know. And maybe either send us the review or tell us where to find it. We love to read them on the air. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
And you are also still twitching at twitch.tv/Tim Longo Jr., where you are. You've gone through all the golden doors, and now you're just off doing this DLC, I gather, in Dark Souls.
Yes.
Astorius.
Yep.
Artorias?
Artorias.
Okay.
Yeah. I started that. One boss down. I think there's somebody mentioned there's 3 bosses or something, so Artorias being one of them. So
cool.
I did start fighting him. Quite a fight. It's definitely good. I guess it's sort of known as one of the better ones in the series, but yeah, it's good. And it's neat. It's neat. New area. There's some new NPCs and stuff, so it's fun. But yeah, I don't know how long it is, but I need to go through the final door, and I don't know how long that is. So this game, this just
who knows?
Yeah, this game is just.
How much of 2023 will Tim spend on Dark Souls?
That's the
question. What's the over under on that one? Yep, it's a real humdinger. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo is by Mark Garcia, who also mans our merch store, which I've been dipping into lately with my new The Blink backpack, which is pretty great. If you go to our pinned tweet and look at the reply on our Twitter, you can find a link to the store. There's some good stuff in there. We're trying to spread the Blink around, so it's always good to have another.
That's the only backpack in existence of that.
Of the Blink. It is true. Mark saw me ordering that on. He saw the order come through, and he was like, I made his night. He's like, I don't know who bought this, but thanks so much. Anyway. Have fun returning to the marker to the planet's surface this week, and good night.
Good night.